Hi, I'm Ken. Happy New Year. I just added two great items to my collection that I'm so excited to share. The first is this envelope right here. Let's make sure that's on the screen. There you go. Yep, this envelope right here. This is an envelope that doesn't even have a stamp on it. And considering that my channel is about my stamp collection, you might be wondering why I am excited to share an envelope that doesn't have a stamp on it. I'll explain that in a minute. The second thing I got was a bit of a splurge for me. One of my areas of collecting that I've always loved is US souvenir sheets. I did a video on my whole collection a while back. I'll try and put a link to that someplace around here. I love all US souvenir sheets, especially the ones that are actually souvenirs of a stamp show or some other event. Although I'm still struggling with some of the more modern sheets that try to look like souvenir sheets to get you to buy multiple copies of that same stamp. Look, I could rant about that for a whole long time, but I did that already in that other video. So if you want more of me ranting about souvenir sheets, go and watch that other video. Anyway, my collection of early US souvenir sheets was almost complete. I was only missing one sheet, and that was the very first one. And this is the sheet that I got. Let's also make sure this is on the screen. Yeah, there we go. This sheet right here is the White Plains souvenir sheet, the very first one the US put out. It was put out at the second International Philatelic Exhibition, and this was quite a splurge for my collecting style. I wrestled with whether to get this or not, but I found this one and I made the leap to complete my collection. In a minute I'll get to this one, but let's get started by looking at this letter first. So this is the letter I got. It was sent on August 24th, 1845 from Dedham, Massachusetts to East Salisbury, Massachusetts. The first U.S. postage stamp was this 5-cent Benjamin Franklin stamp issued in 1847, 2 years after my letter was sent. Ben Franklin is honored on this stamp, and for the longest time he was the first person represented in every stamp series, because he was the first U.S. Postmaster General. That was in 1775 and 1776. So think about that. Ben Franklin was the postmaster 72 years before this stamp was issued. Of course, being the postmaster means that there was a postal system and that mail delivery was an important act of the newly formed country. That means that there was mail in the U.S. for 72 years before the first postage stamp was issued. Mail without any postage stamps. Indeed, mail delivery existed in the colonies and the world even before that. This envelope is what mail looked like in that period. My stamp collection is mostly about the stamps, but I wanted to add this to the start of my collection to help tell the story of stamps before there were stamps. Notice the markings on this envelope, a 5 and a cancel right here. Actually, these markings are faded and kind of difficult to see. I've done some image processing to make it easier. That's better. The first marking to note is that 5 in the upper right corner. That's the equivalent of the stamp. In this case, a 5-cent rate for a normal letter sent a short distance. This letter was sent to East Salisbury, Massachusetts from Dedham, Massachusetts in 1845. That's a distance of about 60 miles, so really not that far. You can tell it's from Dedham by the other markings in the circle on the left. Around the top edge it says Dedham. Along the bottom it says MS, I think, for Massachusetts. In this case that's Massachusetts, not Mississippi. The date stamp is August 26th. And I can only tell the year of this letter from the inside, 1845, although I'm sure there are some experts who would recognize the year based on the Dedham cancel use dates. You can think of this round stamp as the cancel, although that's not quite right. I think the way this worked is that the cancel and the price were both put on in Dedham, but the 5 cents was collected when the letter was picked up in East Salisbury. In those days, the fee was paid by the receiver, and a lot of times people didn't want to pay the fee. That meant the postal system did all the delivery work, but it wasn't clear if they'd get paid until the letter was delivered. With stamps, the letter was prepaid, which was a big advancement for the post office. This letter is old, but I think it's worth opening to show you a little more about the history of the time. Today we have envelopes, but sending mail was expensive back then and done by weight. So the letter itself was formed into its own envelope, and you'll see that in just a second. You can see the remnants of the wax seal right here. Let's get this open. I'm trying to be gentle with it. Let's open it to the first page. There we go. Let's see. That rip in the center of this sheet is where the wax, right there, is where the wax seal was ripped off, probably by Almira Fitz when she opened it in 1845. You can see that the writing here is very small, although the letter isn't written as small or as tightly packed as many letters of the time. Given that letters were sent by weight, you'd want to cram as much text onto a page as you could fit. This is the back of the paper. I've added images of the front and back and transcribed the text into a post on my blog. I've put a link to that in the episode notes if you want a more detailed look of this. You'll notice that the only part of this letter that's not written on is the page that will eventually fold up to form the envelope. This particular letter is from Martha, who I gather was a close friend and possible relative of the addressee, Miss Almira Fitz, who would have been 18 when this letter was sent. Through some research, I found that Almira's father was from Salisbury and had Almira with her mother, whose family was from Dedham. Her mother had died when Almira was only 6. Almira had been teaching school in Dedham, possibly living with her mother's family, perhaps even Martha, it's not clear, for 1 or 2 years. And then mid-school year, Almira went up to Salisbury, where her father was still living. Martha writes, "Beloved friend, I now improve a few moments in answering your letter, which I received after waiting a long time. I had begun to scold about you pretty hard because you did not write. We had concluded that you had someone else to write to, so you didn't care about writing to us anymore, but I believe I won't scold any more about it, for I suppose you wish to hear something else. The folks are all well, excepting your grandmother. She is pretty feeble." In the letter, Martha references that Almira was at school, although it's unclear whether she was teaching or attending. Martha writes at the end, "How much longer is your school going to keep? Come as soon as it's finished. Don't keep me waiting 6 months for an answer." From other public records, I can see that she returned to teaching in Dedham after a year or two, from 1847 until her death in 1850. From the timing and the context, it is plausible that Almira had to leave teaching suddenly to go to her father's to have a child, perhaps give it up for adoption, recover, ultimately returning to teaching in Dedham with her reputation reasonably intact. Martha makes a lot of references to beaux, parties, and chaperones, and seems to be getting little correspondence from Almira, including when she might be back for a visit. Almira would die at age 23, unmarried, so perhaps not everyone was as unaware of the situation as Martha might have been. Otherwise, the letter is Martha's simple report to her friend about the happenings among her friend group and family, the ordinary chatter you might hear between 2 teen friends. Now I'm going to carefully fold this back up, and I think I won't open it again so long as it's in my collection. I have the images of the text if I want to go look again later. Okay, so the steps in folding this is, again, carefully. It folds this way, and then the bottom and top fold together, and then it folds up on itself. Now, you'll see here on the back that there's 2 triangular fold marks where the wax was, and what would have been done at the time is these would have been folded under, which I'm going to do, and then it would have been tucked in to this gap in the letter. And it's a little hard to see, but that's where the wax remnant of the wax being stuck to this was, and where that rip we saw earlier was. So we kind of carefully tuck that in, just like Martha would have done when she wrote the letter and sent it. Careful, careful. And then it kind of tucks into place neatly like that. And then Martha would have sealed it with the wax by opening up just a crack, putting some melted wax in there, and sealing it down. Okay? So now we have our letter neatly folded. Now that it's folded, I'm going to put it into my album. And you'll see in my album that it goes on this first page. It goes on this page right here. Now I've already got a stampless envelope on this page, but this one is from 1851, after the first stamps were actually issued. There was a period when both stamps and stampless envelopes existed together in the postal system. I got this other stampless envelope for my album, but I wanted to upgrade it to one that was sent before postage stamps were released. Now I want to put both these letters on this page. The new one showing a letter from before stamps, and the other one showing a stamps letter from the stamp period. But I want the earlier letter on the top of the page, right here, and I want this one to move down to be second on the page. So I made a new page for both of these. Let me get that out. That's this page right here. So I made a new page for these, and I'm going to go away and put it in. Before I do that, let me just point out that what I had originally labeled this page was stampless covers pre-1847. Well, this one isn't pre-1847. It's actually post-1847. What I changed the title to is Stampless Covers pre-1847 to 1855. Now, that essentially says from all time before 1855, but I wanted this page as it was written to remind me about when postage stamps came into use, and so that the first envelope was before that and the second one is after that. And I'll make notes in it like I've done before to make that make more sense. Anyway, let me put these into the album and I'll be right back. Okay, now let's get that in the book. As I take this out, you'll see my US #1. I'm pretty proud of having that in the album. That was released in 1847, indeed 2 years after our 1845 letter, and a couple years before, 4 years before this letter, which was still valid in 1851, so stamps wouldn't be required until 1855. So there, that fits right in my book. We put that in place. I'm really happy with the way it came out. Now our stamp album shows the story of mail pre-stamps, moving into the stamp era, and then continuing on through the rest of my collection. I'm really happy with how that came out. I think that letter is a great addition to my collection. It's a fantastic reminder of a time before there were postage stamps in the US. The envelope really tells a great story, but the contents sparked my imagination. Well, now let's move on to the second addition to my collection, that White Plains souvenir sheet. This is my new White Plains souvenir sheet. This one is a mint sheet in beautiful condition. They really don't get any better than this. There are no hinge marks on the back, no folds, no ripped perforations. All those defects are really common in this sheet, and it's rare to find one in such good condition. These sheets catalog for about $500, although you should be able to find a good one in the $200 to $300 range. The one I'm showing here now sold on eBay for just $76. It's a horrible copy of the sheet. Let's zoom in on a few of the flaws. This first area shows ripped perfs on the sheet. Those stamps aren't even connected. That can happen over time when the sheet is mishandled, particularly when it's folded. In this area, you can see the evidence of folding. It's along the same line as those ripped perfs. I think each time you look at this sheet, another perf's going to separate. In this area, you can see through the perfs to the back of the stamp and see some paper stuck to the back. I can't see the back, but there are a few of those hinge marks on this sheet for sure. They're either attempts at repair or some stamp hinges that are still visible through the sheet. Still, even in this horrible condition, this sheet sold for $76. So if you're willing to get a defective sheet, you might still be able to grab one at an easier to swallow price. The stamps on the souvenir sheet were originally released in sheets of 100 stamps, just like regular sheets. This is one of those sheets. In honor of the Second U.S. International Philatelic Exposition in 1926, the post office decided to do something special for stamp collectors. They set up a booth, the largest at that stamp show, and printed copies of this souvenir sheet to be sold at the show. Unfortunately, the ones that were actually printed at the show were not perforated or gummed, and they were eventually sent back to the postal system and destroyed. None of those exist anymore. The ones that were actually sold at the show were printed ahead of the show and actually released and sold at the show. A little aside. I got the picture of that show floor from this book from the Spelman Museum. The book is the official catalog of the show. I'll put up the title page on the screen. Really nice book, big, thick, lot of information in it. In researching the White Plains sheet, I wanted more information on the IPEX show in particular, and I was able to find really very little information about the show on the internet. but I was able to find this catalog in the museum library. The internet is great, but it doesn't have everything in it. For that matter, neither does the Spelman Museum, but it did have this wonderful resource that you just can't find online. This is one of the reasons that specialized museums and libraries are so important to us. Besides the map of the show floor, this catalog lists the show coordinators, sponsors, and judges. Let's just give you a sense of that. So here's a page of some of those sponsors and judges. Nice old-timey pictures and lots of good information about them. In the back of it, there's hundreds of listings for all the exhibits in the show. Who knows if Boston 2026 is going to have enough exhibits to outclass this. This was a time when the stamp community was huge, and even though it was early in stamp collecting, what do we have here? I think a total of 600 plus exhibits. That's a lot. Good luck, Boston 2026, but I think you're up to the challenge. Anyway, there's a few articles in here, and of course, lots of historic advertising. So there's a page of advertising. Let's see. Here's another page of advertising. Almost every third page is an advertising, which is how they funded this show. The articles in here also of historic context, and these advertisements make this kind of a fun book to go through. Every copy of this catalog also included an official page of souvenir stamps, not souvenir sheets, but souvenirs from the show. Let me turn to that and show you. These were printed by the American Banknote Company, and these are really incredible stamps. There's actually 4 designs of these stamps, and I'll pop those up over the top. These feature 2 globes, a post rider, a ship, a train, and an airplane. I think that's a Jenny, but I've never seen one right side up, so I'm not really that sure. Anyway, funny jokes from me. This book has only 3 of these stamps. Let me just pull it up again. It only has the 3 of these stamps, and I can't say why, although these 3 stamps aren't even hinged into this book. As I was checking on how they were attached to this page, one of them came loose so I could see the back, and it looked like it had been stuck down to something else. Not this book, and the back was looked like it had been just licked and stuck to something, and years later maybe ripped off. There was a giant thin spot, and then it had been lightly licked back to be stuck into this book. Yikes! Anyway, I took the one that I checked. I hinged it neatly back into this book. Hopefully, no more damage will come to the stamp. Anyway, I was thrilled to get this book and look through it. Don't forget that the Spelman Library exists, the Spelman Museum exists, and it can be a great partner in any philatelic research that you're doing. Now, let's get back to looking at those white plain sheets. Instead of printing the sheet in panes of 100, they printed up 4 panes of 25 stamps per pane on one bigger sheet. I couldn't find any examples of that pane of 4 souvenir sheets. Perhaps none exist, I'm really not sure. Anyway, coming off the press, they would have looked something like this. Actually, the ones coming off the press would have been unperforated and ungummed. Each pane had writing along the top and bottom. On the top, you'll see International Philatelic Exhibit, October 16th to 23rd, 1926. You'll also notice the plate number below that. Along the bottom of each pane, it says New York, New York, USA, the location of the show. Above that is another plate number. Coming off the press, all 4 of these sheets would have been connected. Next, they would have been gummed and perforated before being cut into 4 sheets. It's a little hard to see, but between the sheets is a red cut line. Here's a segment of a sheet where the lines are still visible. Those red lines run the width of the sheet, and the position of remnants of those lines is one way to figure out which of the 4 plate positions a particular sheet came from. But you really don't need those lines to figure it out. Another way is to look at the gum on the back. The gum was applied before the sheets were cut, and they didn't gum all the way to the edges of the selvage. You can see which edges are the edges of the sheet because the gum doesn't go all the way to the edge. While I have this sheet up, I should mention one other thing in this image. You might notice some diagonal creases in the sheet. These were a normal part of the production process, so if you're looking to get a pristine copy of this sheet, don't worry about seeing these creases. They're not flaws in the sheet. Of course, the easiest way to tell the pane positions is that the outer frame of each sheet is wider than the inner frames. Also, the top 2 panes each have a triangular cutout that was part of the printing process. It should be straightforward to figure out which position a sheet is from based on the margins and these cutouts. Some people go as far as to find a match set of all 4 of these positions for a single plate number. You'll also notice that there are 4 plate numbers on each pane. This particular sheet shows plate number 18771, one on each edge of each pane. It turns out that 5 different plates were used to print these sheets. The first was 18770. Plate 18665 through 69 were used to print the original 100 stamp sheets. You'll also find the souvenir sheets with plates 18771, 73, and 74. Yes, I skipped 72. There was actually a plate number 18772. That was the plate that got used for the demonstrations on the exhibit hall floor. 700 of these demonstration sheets were printed, all without gum or perforations. All of these imperforate sheets were sent back to the post office department and destroyed. None seem to have escaped into collectors' hands. There are some collectors that look for all 4 positions of all 4 plates for a total of 16 sheets of this souvenir sheet. It's exhausting to even think about that. You might wonder, though, of all these 16 plate position combinations, which is the best one to collect? As it turns out, there are 2 of them that are slightly different from the others. These 2 panes have a minor plate flaw that makes them catalog for slightly more than the others. It's called the dot over the S variety. These are what are called constant varieties. That is, they exist on every copy from this plate. This plate flaw shows up on the lower left panes of plates 18773 and 74, but in different positions. I've marked the stamp where the flaw is on both those plates. You'd think that because these 2 plates are listed with the same flaw name that the flaw would be the same, but the flaws on these 2 plates are a little bit different. The 18774 plate on the right actually has what looks like a dot above the S in states. From the 73 pane, the flaw is more of a scratch in the same area that I guess ends in a dot-like clump over the same S. They really aren't the same flaw at all. While there are used copies of both the whole sheet and singles with selvage from this sheet, I'm not sure there are any known used singles with these 2 flaws. I'm not sure people really look for them. So here's an assignment. If you have a used copy of the single, which you can generally assume is from the sheet of 100, check to see if yours has one of these flaws. That would be a real treasure to find. Let's take a closer look at this particular pane now. You can tell from the wide margins and the triangle cutout on the upper right that this is the pane from the upper right of the sheet. It's possible to find an upper right sheet without the triangle cutout, but that only happens if someone trimmed off the edges of the pane. That would be a significant flaw. This is a copy that has been trimmed along the top. You can tell because the triangle's missing, and yet the top and right margins are wider than the other 2. It's possible that the top margin was damaged and someone trimmed it to hide that damage. It's also possible that someone thought the triangle cutout was a flaw and were trying to hide that. Either way, this sheet is flawed. There's another interesting way to tell with this sheet. Notice along the middle of the right edge, there's a small F in the margin. That F only appears on the upper right panes. Here's that untrimmed pane again. Notice the F? During the 20s and 30s, that F was stamped into plates after they were hardened to indicate they were ready to be printed with. Some people say that the F stands for finished. I prefer the story that the F was the stamp of the foreman of the hardening section. His name was Frank Marti, and that the F stands for Frank. True or not, it's a much better story. If I ever get another one of these souvenir sheets, and that's highly unlikely, I'll be getting an upper right pane with the cutout and the F stamp. These sheets are expensive for a couple of reasons. First, there were only 107,000 of them made. That's just 25,000 of each plate number, and another 7,000 of the demonstration plate number that was destroyed after the show. For comparison, there were more than 40 million copies printed of the stamps from the 100 stamp sheets. The next souvenir sheet released was this 25 stamp sheet of Fort Dearborn stamps, released at the Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair, which included the Convention of the American Philatelic Society, in a way, 2 souvenirs in one. There were over 456,000 copies of this sheet, more than 4 times the number printed for the White Plains sheet. Notice one more thing about this Fort Dearborn sheet. It's not perforated, and that means it's far less fragile than the White Plains sheet. I'd like to say that the white plain souvenir sheet is expensive because it's the world's first souvenir sheet, but it isn't. While it is the first for the US, other countries had released souvenir sheets before this one. This is the first sheet that the Scott catalog lists as a souvenir sheet. This sheet of 10 stamps from Luxembourg marked the ascension of the Grand Duke William IV to the throne in 1906. I think it's dubious to call this a souvenir sheet, but Scott and many collectors disagree with me. Or how about this Luxembourg mini sheet released in 1921? It has just 5 stamps and features Duchess Charlotte. It honors the birth of Prince Jean. For some odd reason, Scott doesn't list this as a souvenir sheet. Go figure. Many people consider this 1923 sheet from Luxembourg to be the first souvenir sheet. Scott lists it as a souvenir sheet, just like the 1906 sheet. And except that it only has 1 stamp instead of 5, I can't see why this is more souvenir-like than the earlier one. This stamp shows a view of Luxembourg and was released in honor of the birth of Princess Elizabeth. Still not a souvenir in my mind. Again, collectors and Scott don't agree with me on this. An argument can be made for this 1924 sheet from Belgium. It was released for the International Stamp Show in Belgium. The cancel in the upper right shows that. This is truly a souvenir sheet. Well, I guess you might argue that the cancel is the souvenir rather than the sheet. I won't argue with you about that. But I don't think anyone can argue with this one. This sheet was issued in France in 1925 as a souvenir of the Paris International Postage Stamp Exposition. That was a year before the US issued our white plain souvenir sheet. By comparison, the white plain sheet seems a bit sloppy in its execution. Still, this sheet has always felt special to me, and I'm so happy to have finally added it to my collection. Enough now with the history of this sheet. Let's get it into my album. Let's see. This is my souvenir sheet album. And let's set it here and move to it, and we'll get it up on the screen. And this is the page that the sheet is going to go on to. I filled in all the other early pages with the souvenir sheets that I have, and I've gone through these in pretty good detail on my earlier video. I think that it's pretty complete up to the point where I have this sheet right here. And in fact, I think I've completed almost everything in this early section up to when this World War I sheet came out in 1991. This is the point, though, where the definition of souvenir sheet gets a little bit fuzzy. So up to this, I'm complete with actual real souvenir sheets. But at this point, things get a little bit fuzzy. I'm not sure that I'd call this sheet a souvenir sheet, but I've included it in this souvenir sheet album because I think this is kind of where it belongs, whether it's actually a souvenir sheet or not. Let's turn forward a little bit again. You can see all these pages in here until I reach the 1997 Pacific 97 International Stamp Exhibition. This is an actual souvenir sheet from that show. And I've definitely included it in my album. But this souvenir sheet album is getting fuzzy after the World War I souvenir sheet. There's a few modern souvenir sheets that I have no doubt about, but I'm really not focused on finishing that album with those. To my thinking, the only souvenir sheet that was missing in this album was this white plain souvenir sheet. So let's go back to the beginning and get that put in here onto this page. Let's see. So this right here is the souvenir sheet. I want to take it out of this hard cardboard that I've got it in to protect it. I'm going to be a little bit careful because I don't want to damage the sheet in the process. So let's take this out. This sheet is, you can see, I think, that this sheet is just a little bit taller than the sheet that it goes in. This is the official mount that this souvenir sheet is meant to go into. But remember that there's the sheets along the top of the 4 panes and the ones on the bottom, and mine is along the bottom right to be specific, and it doesn't really fit into this sheet quite as well as I'd like to. So I will keep a lookout for a replacement mount for this sheet, but for now I think this gets it into the album, and that's the safest place for it. And as soon as I have something to fit it better for this particular sheet, I'll replace it. So let's get this tacked on in. So when I do this, for a sheet like this, I give it just a little bit of liquid along the top. and I do just a tiny bit at the top just to make sure that it sticks and can come off later. And for this one, I'm going to give 2 little tacks down here at the bottom. One here and one here, far enough away so that I don't get the gum. And then I'm going to neatly position it in the lines. And there we go. Oh, almost. There we go. I think that's good. So there it is, my new White Plains sheet neatly put into the album. Done. So this stamp right down here at the bottom is not from one of these sheets, or we presume it's not from one of these sheets. It's actually impossible to tell whether this stamp is from one of these sheets or from one of those paints of 100. But the rule is that if it's unlabeled or unidentifiable someplace, we consider it to be part of that 100 sheet. Now, I've put it in here as an example of that plate. If I wanted to, I could look for an example from this sheet, but the only way to make sure I had an example from this sheet either is to get one that had the plate number attached, that's always interesting, or some of this bottom or top selvage on it. If I find one of those, I'll put it in here. Certainly if I get a used copy of the sheet, I'll add a page for that sheet, and if I get other copies of this sheet, which is kind of unlikely. There is one other way that we've talked about that you can tell that you have one single from this sheet, and that's those dot over the S varieties we talked about a little bit earlier. But you'll see for every sheet that I have in this album, I have some examples of the stamps that are associated with that sheet, just as a way to kind of round out the pages. There's a few more things I could add to this souvenir sheet album, and I'll do it as that happens. But I otherwise think this album is done with the addition of this White Plains souvenir sheet. I'd love for you to drop a note in the comments. I love seeing notes in the comments from all of you about anything exciting you've added to your collection recently. Anyway, I'd love to hear more from you. Happy New Year, and I wish you continued happy collecting.